Thank you very much to both the other speakers, and I want to come back up for, we've got 5 to 10 minutes for questions, which I'll open up to in a minute. Just my reflection is on the connect between both of your messages, basically, around how important leadership is, and that one of the first key steps is strategizing to achieve delivery. Well, that sits in the hands of, in the laps of leaders, doesn't it? So, and perhaps behaviour change sandwiched between the two of those talks is one of the ways to get people to do that. So thank you very much, both of you. Okay, so I'll open it up to questions from the floor. Does anyone want to raise your hand? And if you just, when you get a mic, say who you are, and if your question is directed to any particular one of us, then...
Yeah, I'm Joe. I'm from UCLH. I'm the sustainability lead there. I've got a question for Dave. Some of our buildings are very old, and as like a lot of NHS buildings, sometimes are only just held up, and the maintenance that goes into them is really difficult. So how do you have the kind of conversation that you've just outlined on an estate where the priority is so far away from that, it's simply maintaining it, allowing patients to be seen in those buildings?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and very close to the example I gave. For us, the biggest catalyst of change has been the cost of energy. You know, we have been talking about this stuff for quite a long time, but it falls down the list. And then you start looking at, you know, do you live with your current buildings, or is it time to rip them down and replace them, the embedded carbon costs and so on? I think the only way that's going to drive change is the cost of energy and the availability of funding to support renovation or new builds. Because essentially, if the only way that the NHS estate is going to actually improve itself is controlled by a purse string which says you have to improve yourself in a sustainable way, then they've got no choice. And that, I think, is a key driver. And it's a fairly unattractive thing because, I mean, somebody said in their thing, everyone knows that we have to do this. But going back to my example, you know, it's hard to concentrate on those future dynamics when you've got water running down the walls. So what's going to power, where's the urgency? And I think it comes from either funding criteria or actually, you know, running out of money to keep the lights on unless you start saving energy. So it's not a very, you know, visionary answer, but pragmatically, I think those are the only things I'm seeing, and not just in the UK, by the way, globally.
Sorry, waiting patiently. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Johnny Groom. I'm an anaesthetic consultant and a greener theatres lead at Barts Health. This is a question for Dave. Thank you for 3 fantastic presentations, by the way. I think in the last 5 years, clinicians and estates have started talking to each other a lot more. But I feel when it comes to building and managing systems and trying to update them, we're really held back by HTMs and HBNs, which are woefully outdated and are based on evidence from 10 years ago by the time they come to fruition. As an industry leader, how do you think you could work with people writing those to try and be a bit more forward-focused?
That's a really brilliant question. I think, for me, the lever is actually defining the internal rate of return. So we look at HTMs and so on as standards. In other geographies, we actually look at that internal rate of return and what do we need to do to justify an investment in this type of technology. Because essentially, when we say, you know, we want £1 million to upgrade a building management system, for example, we're competing with an MRI machine or whatever, a piece of kit. Now, in a private health system, you know, like the US, I'll take as an example, they simply compete for the money. You know, which one's going to have the best rate of return? What we're seeing now, because of energy costs, is actually the internal rate of return on this type of investment actually is about the same as they can get from buying a new MRI machine or a brain scan or whatever. So I think we need to, I'm not sure this is answering your question, I think in terms of writing the standards, we have a duty actually as an industry to work on those, particularly those minimum design standards. But I think we need to express them differently. I think we need to be quite mercenary and say, actually, don't spend money unless it's going to give you, in the US, it's about 21%, unless it's a sort of 5-year ROI. So actually build into those standards something that is leveraged by an internal rate of return, because then people know that if you spend £1 million, it's actually going to take you 5 years to get your money back, and you compare that to spending it on I don't know, a new car park or electric vehicle chargers, and you've got some maths, because otherwise it just becomes a nice to have. And we're running out of time. It's not a nice to have. So I don't think that answers your question, but I'll pick it up with you later.
Can I jump in?
Oh, sorry.
So I think this is not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things about ROI is that the devil's in the detail, and it's important to account for everything you can within scope. So for instance, if your building is falling down and there's water running down the walls, you're much likely to have increased staff turnover and staff sickness. And if you can provide a nicer environment in which people want to come and work, with, for instance, in my happy world, good active travel access, then your staff turnover costs will reduce, so your HR costs will reduce. And it's important to incorporate all that into your ROI calculation if you can, because sometimes when things get marginal on the price of electricity or power, that can tip the balance.
Can I, sorry, I will move on, but it comes back to the digitisation as well, because if we digitise and we can measure it, we've got a chance of actually measuring those impacts. So I'll give an example in that swanky building I showed on the first slide, and it's kind of like a boutique hotel, right? It's a money, no object type investment, but we've really put a lot of technology into the patient room, so there's lots of, the patients can control their total environment, the lights, the blinds, the heat, the entertainment system. It's pretty phenomenal. Like a 100-inch TV screen, and it's got all the patient records, all really smart. And what we've seen there is actually nurses' footfall reduced by about 5,000 steps a day. Now, we didn't measure it before properly, right? We should have done, and we're going to have to try and re-engineer it. But essentially, because the patients are controlling their own environment, 70% of nurse calls are related to that patient, to the patient comfort, and they just do it by themselves. And actually, patient satisfaction's gone up because they think they're not bothering the nurses who are busy. But actually, we can digitise it, we can measure it, and we have these benefits. But I think from a research point of view and developing those ROIs, we've got to be a bit more visionary. In that case, we didn't, right? We didn't foresee that. But we're trying to do something similar now. But I think there's lots of those connections that have to go into the mix, because you're right, if we start looking at it in tight envelopes, the maths may be ambiguous.
ROI is a really good example of a technique that behaviourists use, which is think about who's sitting around the table where you have to persuade them to do something, and what are their hooks, what floats their boat. And obviously the finance person, it has to save money. I may care about the other stuff, but I can't pay my mortgage if I don't do my job, which is to make sure the money balances. Clinicians, it may be individual patient care, patient safety, public health officers, it's population, and so on. And something we all naturally do is we make our pitches based on what convinced us, but different things float our boats of the things that float the audience's boats of thinking about an ROI. I remember one time in Warrington, someone had a brilliant idea that cost £1 million and saved 3, so net saving of 2 million. And they came out of the chief finance officer's room having pitched it, looking really dejected, and we asked them what they did, and they said, I went in and said, could I have £1 million, and got short shrift. And they said, well, don't mention it again for a few weeks, so it goes out of the chief finance officer's head. And then go back in a few weeks and walk in and say, would you like to save 2 million quid and see if you get a difference? And he did, and he got the money, because it's just about how do I tick your box so that you'll listen to my idea. There was another question here.
Thank you. Paul Batchelor from University College London and UCLan and the College of General Dentistry. An observation, first of all. One, I can't help but think about HS2 and how that's been handled. And when you're talking about strategy, I simply have got no idea where it's going to start or end at the moment. And that is despite the billions going into it. And I think there's something there about when you're looking at a global arrangement or a project of that size, that it needs, it's similar in many ways to the health service, and therefore we need far better thinking from our political leaders. The second thing is pick up on Frank's point, and I think the workforce is critical. The slide that you put up about the determinants, which I'm going to is really the question. But the issue about determinants there and climate change is the impact on the workforce is enormous. And as climate change increases in temperatures and stuff, the ability of a workforce to handle healthcare gets worse and worse and worse, and that is something that's going to have to be tackled rapidly given the problems. The third issue, though, is really what is the purpose of the health service? And I come back to that because the determinants of health, by and large, lie outside the health sector. And what has to happen, I would argue, is that we need to work with those agencies, both voluntary, community-based, and far better working between primary and secondary care in order to deal with this problem. In fact, we don't want people to use the health service. And so how does the panel see that happening better than it currently is?
So thanks, it's a great question. As a start of an answer, let me tell you what's happening in West Yorkshire, because that's what I know. The climate change team sits in West Yorkshire within a group called the Improving Population Health Board, and that consists of public health consultants, primary care, voluntary and third sector. We've got somebody in the local housing association who's on our panel, and our function within the ICS is to drive the left shift, so prevention. And we are all about reducing inequalities and helping primary and secondary care embrace what I think is their responsibility to do some sort of more traditional public health behaviours stuff in order to reduce the development of disease, which then leads to the hugely expensive financially and environmentally secondary care 10 years down the line. So there's definitely glimmers of hope. And I would suggest that the way that's structured in West Yorkshire is better than it was 5-10 years ago.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name's Becca. I'm a junior doctor and the new clinical sustainability lead at Ipswich and Colchester. And I was just wondering if you've got any advice on how to engage clinicians and kind of encourage that behavioural change where they don't necessarily see it as their responsibility and they're very reluctant to change their way of practicing. They've got reasonable fears, but just, do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, lots.
I'm glad you said that.
And happy to talk to you afterwards as well. But and there's always something that hooks someone into pretty much every single agenda. And often, humans like to think that, we all like to think that we're altruistic, that we do things for the greater good. And that is part of what drives us to make the choices that we do and how we behave. But underneath it all is something that we hide from ourselves, which is egocentricity and what's in it for me. And there's always something that's in it for an individual. If they're swamped with workload, if they're seeing the wrong patients, if they're frustrated by whatever it might be in the process. If you find those and help them see that by engaging in your agenda, they're actually helping themselves in that regard, as well as doing better for patients and all of that type of thing. That's very headline, but that's essentially where, if we were working with you, that's where we'd be diving in first. Find those hooks for those individuals.
I'm very happy to talk to you later as well. I could perhaps tell you how I've got it wrong and tell you some of the scars I carry, because it does feel like a war of attrition.
Just take this lady and this gentleman, then we'll stop.
That's Kent and Medway. I'm the Greener NHS lead, and we're doing a lot of work around behaviour change, particularly within our workforce. The question is how do you sustain that behaviour change? So it's all very good doing one-day awareness days and things like that, asking people to, bring in a recyclable cup, but actually how do we sustain change, not just that day, that year, but going well in advance in the future? How do we keep reminding people and get people to keep doing the things we're asking them to do?
So that's all about opportunity within ComB, and what are the, how do we change the system so that these new things that we teach them can become habit. It's one of the biggest barriers to education or training courses leading to sustained change is that most people don't get the opportunity to do the thing they've learned regularly enough for it to become a habit, or even quickly. So one of our biggest frustrations is all about unconscious bias training around equality and diversity recruitment. Utterly pointless. If you don't recruit immediately afterwards, you don't get to use it, and appreciating your unconscious bias isn't the same as mitigating it, and it's only the processes within the recruitment itself that can stop our unconscious biases will happen whether we're aware of them or not. About removing the ability for them to influence the answer as much as they do, which is nothing to do with training, it's all to do with process. So process that enables them to keep doing the new habit and make it harder to do the old habit as well. That helps make the new thing easier to do than the hard thing, the old thing. So if we have one more question, and then we'll stop for
Hi,
break.
I'm Terry Campbell, GP from Bristol. And this is a question for Matthew and Frank. So I completely agree that good leadership is actually vital in the NHS, and I completely agree that we need to have behaviour change to actually optimise our path towards net zero. But my question really is, what's the NHS strategy for getting good behaviour change in our leaders? Because if we can't get it in them, how the hell can we get it in the rest of the NHS workforce?
Great question.
I'll have a go if you want to think about it.
Just thinking about whether I'm brave enough to answer.
Okay, you think about that, I'll talk. Again, I think it's a really, really excellent point. And in fact, I was talking to somebody this morning about it. I can't see him now. So one of the things that I've done has been to be involved in the development of sustainability, a free sustainability leadership course available through the NHS Leadership Academy, which is online. And I'm also doing some work with the Graduate Management Training Scheme to provide some sustainability training to them, because I think that as the next generation of leaders and managers and execs come through the NHS, I think that there's an opportunity for fairly rapid change, because I think that the current senior leadership have, by and large, have not grown up in an era of being concerned about climate change. And I think that the coming through generation has. And I think that there's an opportunity there to really activate the generation that's coming through, not only to make better sustainability leadership decisions, but also as they come through to challenge the current leadership. And so that's my answer, is to try and do what we can to train the next generation. And that doesn't mean that we can wait for a whole generation change, but to encourage the generation that's coming to challenge the current generation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, a lot of people talk about, a lot of leaders talk about enabling speaking truth to power, but they talk about it more than they actually mean it. And when you do it, you find yourself often isolated and then distanced. So that's the thing. That's a problem. There are leaders out there who embrace the need for things like behaviour change training for leaders. So, for example, our work's embedded in postgraduate stuff at Warwick Business and Health faculties, Salford Health faculty, the faculty for medical leaders in management, which the Royal College's fund and where most of the clinical fellows come from. It's in there, so it's spreading, but that's not the same as the actual leaders, political and national health system necessarily recognising its my belief its fundamental importance for agendas like this and recovery and retention and all of the other things that are on people's minds. So I've been in NHS England for 10 years now, and I haven't managed to achieve what you're asking. So I suppose the shorter version of my answer is I haven't worked it out yet, but we're all still trying. And on that cheery... Oh, sorry.
Well,
do you wanna-
if I might come back again, I think I have definitely seen a change in leadership. So when I first started talking about this 15 years ago, I was laughed out of offices left, right and centre. And actually now, I bet it's definitely 5 years since anybody said to me, I don't think that's important in healthcare. I think you should stay in your lane. You know, haven't you got anything else to worry about? And I think that now what I see and I hear is the senior leaders saying, yes, I think that's really important. Can you help me? What do I need to say? What do I need to do? So I think people now have perhaps transitioned into a position of conscious incompetence. And that's difficult for leaders to accept, isn't it? Because, they want to be seen as capable leaders. And so I think there is definitely a change happening, but it's not nearly fast enough.
And actually, just on a cheery note, these shifts are possible. So in 2007 and 2008, my predecessors and I started building the Right Care programme and started using the concepts and the term unwarranted variation, which no one else was using. And now it's one of the most common terms used in improvement conversations and improvement strategy and decision making. So you can achieve it, and I guess it's about belligerence and patience. In both senses of the word. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. If we just give these two another round of applause. Thank you. And we're slightly over, but you had a very long break scheduled anyway, so I think if we'll stick to time and come back at 5 to 11, please. Thank you very much.